Everybody for coming. We're going to walk through kind of the important pieces of GP security. Hopefully you'll learn something that you don't already know, and we'll sort of show you where the Fastpath tools fit in along the way. So even if you've been using GP and GP security for a while, there may be something new in here for you. I'm Mark Polino, the Director of Client Services for Fastpath. I'm involved in a lot of the training and implementation pieces, so there's a decent chance we will bump into each other somewhere along the way. I've written a couple of GP books, and if you just like being scared, and if you're using GP security, then you like being scared at some point in time, there's a couple of scary novels in there too, so that you can see that I'm human and not a robot. Just a brief look at GP security, because when we talk about GP security, a lot of times we really talk about, we're thinking of setting up users in GP and what they can do. But there's really a lot more to it. There's really security for GP, SSRS, management reporter. GP's new workflow security is completely separate from its previous security. Web client, new OData security inside of GP 2016, and then all of the things that connect in. And so when you start to look at that, it's a lot. We're going to start with GP security and kind of walk through the important pieces, and then I'll touch on the others along the way. So just a refresher for everybody, GP security is made up of windows, the ability to post, reports, forms, all of those roll up into tasks. And so a task is going to give you the ability to go to a window and print a report and post that window potentially, and those types of things. Tasks then get combined into roles, and roles get assigned to users. So we're going to start with roles for just a second. There's some challenges with the base roles inside of GP. They have lots of overlapping permissions. So a default AP clerk role inside of GP can create a vendor, create a voucher, and cut a check for that voucher. And that's a problem because you don't have good segregation of duties, and it means that it's relatively straightforward for someone to do something inappropriate. They create a fake vendor, get a fake invoice through the system, and essentially issue themselves a check. This has happened and continues to happen all of the time, which is why things like segregation of duties are important. The default GP roles were not built with segregation of duties in mind. They were built with getting a job done from beginning to end in mind, which is why they tend to have a lot of overlapping permissions. There's also not a lot of transparency. It's not always obvious that some of these roles have the ability to post or some of these other permissions that are hiding in there. And just as an example, there's a link here to a list of the default roles in GP and the tasks that are behind them and what those tasks can do. So if you're in a position where you're getting some pushback on doing some cleanup for GP security, this is a great kind of starting point to be able to say, hey, look, this is the basic GP security role, and it can do all of this stuff. This is really not what we want. This doesn't really create a great secure environment. So just a quick reminder for folks, I've got a user and I'm assigning roles to them. It's as simple as checking a box, so the actual process is really easy. But what's hiding behind these roles in tasks and the security objects behind the tasks, that's where it gets to be a bit more exciting. So for us at Fastpath, as we work with GP, really tasks are the key because the tasks tend to be very discrete. They don't have a lot of extraneous elements in them. They're generally well designed, and they generally include what you need to do a task. So if a task has hidden windows or if it has extra windows that hang off the main window, generally speaking, a task is going to give you the appropriate permissions for those pieces to do what needs to be done. They're not be-all and end-all, but focusing on tasks rather than roles and really taking these good GP tasks and building them into better roles tends to be a really effective strategy with GP for getting better security. It won't get you 100% there, but it'll get you at least 80 and maybe 90% of the way there, which for many folks is a whole lot better than where they're at now. We'll talk more about this when we get to some of the recommendations at the end, but just as a kind of a core recommendation with GP, if you start with existing tasks and build new roles out of them, you will generally be much happier than if you try to carve up the existing roles or make changes to them to try to make things fit. And just a quick look at task assignments here as a reminder for folks. So I've got a role ID, and then these are the tasks that are assigned. We get to see the description behind those tasks, and clicking on this will let you drill back, but to see what's in there. But these descriptions aren't necessarily everything that's in a task or a role. You have to take them with a grain of salt. All right, so let's talk about power users. So a power user in GP is a user who has access to everything in the system. It's not actually a role in the sense that a role gives someone explicit permission to do something. GP looks at a role and it says, can this user create a customer? Yes, off you go. With power user, it doesn't do that. Instead of saying, does this user have a role that lets them create a customer? It says, let's look at this role. Oh, that's a power user. Stop. Don't check any further. Let them do whatever they want. So aside from extreme access and having way too much access, this means that power users also don't appear on security reports. So if an auditor comes to you and says, I want to know everybody who has access to create a customer in GP, and you give them that list and they do some digging and they find a customer that was created by a power user, that creates a problem for them because that user's not on their list and they're going to come ask, why is this user not on the list? And so then you have to give them a list of all of the users who have access to create a customer and all of your power users. And so at this point, you've made a statement about your system and it's been incorrect. So they tend to do a lot more testing and a lot more work around items once that happens. So it's really important to understand what goes into a power user and what they can and can't do. So in addition, just having too much access, even without any negative or malicious intent, can create real problems. I was sitting in I used to be a GP consultant, and I was sitting in a client's office. They had been set up by someone else, and their GP was set up incorrectly. It used a VPN, and everything was horribly slow. While we were sitting there, she was clicking on things randomly, trying to get the system to respond while she was talking to us across the desk. When the system finally caught up, what she had done is clicked enough buttons that she erased her entire accounts receivable in the process. So in this case, she didn't have any backups. We'll talk about that in a minute. And they had to go back to a printed accounts receivable that was 2 weeks old. There was nothing malicious. She wasn't intending to do anything wrong. She was simply trying to get the system to respond and managed to do something really bad because she had way too much access. We would prefer that you don't use super users or use power users at all. It's too much access for the vast majority of people. If you must have a super user of some kind, the recommendation then is that you create your own. And I've got a set of SQL scripts that do, and instructions that do what you need to do. Instead of a user where GP says, oh, this is a power user, let them do whatever they want, this is a user where GP says, yes, this user has explicit permission to everything. So even though it mimics a power user, it does at least show up on reports, and it does have explicit permission. It's not just overriding everything. And then there's the SA user. So the SA user, there's a lot of confusion around this, and there's a lot of misinformation in GP around the SA user. The SA user is really only required in any version of GP beyond and including 2013 R2. The only thing you need SA for is installation tasks. Prior to that, GP10, GP 2010, the GP 2013 early release or release to manufacturing, the only thing you needed SA for was a couple of professional services tools. That's it. So even for the vast majority of GP installations from 10 forward, you only need SA for a couple of professional services tools, and once you hit GP 2013 R2, you only need it for installing GP and installing third-party products. So the next question that a lot of people ask is, well, what about adding users? I need to be SA to add users. That's not correct. The way that it works is to add users in GP, you can take a regular GP user, go into SQL Server, this is a SQL Server setting, and give that user elevated access in SQL Server. One example would be System Administrator access in SQL Server. This will let an ordinary GP user be able, assuming they have appropriate permissions in GP, then they now have the SQL permissions to create and manage users. The pushback on this is that a SQL DBA will say, well, that's the same thing. And it's not the same thing for a couple of reasons. One is that SA is difficult to trace because it is not one user, it's anyone with the SA password. Whereas if you're using a GP user, then you actually know what user that is. Secondly, because GP encrypts the password, you can't directly access SQL with a GP user. You can only access SQL within the context of GP. So if you have permissions to do something in GP and that passes through to SQL, then it will allow that to happen. It won't let you hop into SQL Server Management Studio using your GP credentials and do whatever you want. That encryption piece that prevents GP logins from being used anywhere other than GP is really what gives you additional security around this and prevents them from functioning like a system administrator in SQL Server. The same thing also applies if you want the user to use the GP built-in functionality to do backups and restores. You can do the exact same setup. All right, a couple of things. There's another set of users in GP that are limited and self-service users. These folks have predefined roles, so a limited user can only view items in GP. They can only do certain approvals like requisitions, and they can do a requisition request. They can't do some other things around purchase orders. It's a very kind of management limited role. And then a self-service role is really limited to self-service user type things like creating a timesheet, an expense report, creating a requisition request, that type of thing. So they have built-in limitations, but there are also pre-built roles and tasks that work pretty well for the limited and self-service users. So if I have a limited user that has access to look up anything in the system, and I really want to limit them to just the purchasing module, there's a role and associated task that will make that happen and not give them access to other parts of the system. I could give them just that role. If I wanted them to have access to purchasing and financials, I could give them just those two roles. And then there's some other kind of security items to consider here. One is security of SQL Server. You really want to pay attention to who can do different things inside of SQL Server. We'll talk about all the other elements of GP. This is more of a perimeter control of GP. You don't want everybody to have access to SQL Server to be able to tiptoe through your payroll data from behind the scenes and that type of thing. So it is important to secure your SQL Server. It does hold all of the GP data. So restricting access to GP is great, but if you're then opening up all of that data and the ability to manipulate that data behind the scenes, that's not a good idea. This is also a spot where Fastpath's audit trail products can really help because we audit at the SQL Server level. So for example, if someone were to go in through SQL Server and make changes to data in GP, Audit Trail tool is there to be able to grab that information, to be able to show you who made the change, what the old value was, what the new value was, when they made the change, and the fact that that change was made via SQL Server versus via the GP interface. So in terms of really controlling and understanding that back door, Fastpath's audit trail tool is really a huge help with that. We have a lot of people who audit at the SQL level. When I was a controller, we had Fastpath audit trail. We used it for GP, but then we also had an industry-specific accounts receivable sales module. It was very specific to what we did as an industry, and it would integrate into GP via an import. We used Audit Trail to audit that as well because it was also a SQL Server application on the same server, so we were able to audit changes there too because that was really the system that fed GP. Some other big considerations are password management and reset. Password management is important. It becomes more important in the world in which we live, and password resets become a giant pain in the butt. The simplest and best fix for this in GP, very honestly, is Fastpath's Config AD and identity management. So Config AD lets you connect GP to Active Directory security so that when users log in, they're not logging in with a GP password, they're logging in with their ordinary Active Directory password, their normal ordinary network password that they log in with every day, the one they don't forget because every morning they type in the same thing. Now that a user is authenticated to the server, that can be passed into GP as a single sign-on, and they can go directly into GP, or we can turn on a speed bump, which lets them have to type their network password in again. So that's useful in areas where someone might get up and leave their machine unattended, and you don't want someone to be able to just go in there and fire up GP and start doing things. So single sign-on with password required is also an option. But in terms of managing users and those types of things, Config AD is fantastic. And then identity management. And so the idea behind identity management is when I'm ready to set up a user or manage a GP user, I can simply go and fill out a form, mark what I want that user, that I need in a user, what companies they need access to, what roles they need access to, those types of things. It runs through an approval workflow, and then once the final approval is done, it just automatically goes into Dynamics GP. There's nothing else you need to do. So it really eliminates a lot of those management pieces because you've got really self-service set up, but then you've got approval to validate those that self-service setup, that is what we want, that is correct, and if not, it can go back and be fixed. And when everything is finally approved, there's nothing else to do. It just updates inside of GP. A place that we're seeing a lot of requests from companies that are getting set up for their auditors, talking to their auditors, really is orphaned users. The auditors are very concerned about orphaned users. We're seeing a mixture of requests. When someone leaves the organization, should they be disabled in GP or should they be deleted in GP? And it seems to be running about 50-50 depending on the auditors. So GP will allow you to inactivate a user, and GP will allow you to delete a user. It doesn't matter which one you do. Fastpath Audit Trail will retain that it was that user who did the work. GP records, the ones that have things like posted by, it will retain that whether you delete or inactivate a user. Even better though, for managing that, if you're using Config AD, what happens is when you delete a user from Active Directory, then it can automatically either delete or disable at your choice that user inside of Dynamics GP. So effectively, you're eliminating much of that orphaned user problem because it's really moved up to IT at that point. And when someone leaves the organization, the first thing that gets turned off is their network access, their email, those types of things. That's all Active Directory driven. Now you're adding GP into that mix so that when you deactivate a user, you delete a user in Active Directory, GP is one of those applications that also gets that user either inactivated or deleted. Don't forget about the system password in GP. The way I like to think of the system password is it's a bit of a speed bump. It is not the be-all and end-all. The system password in GP can be really helpful if someone gains inappropriate access to a machine, and they try to do something, and they run into the system password, and they don't know it. It's sort of that last line of defense when everything else has gone wrong. I would not count on it as a primary or even a secondary security piece. Too many people know it. It's a single password. It frequently gets passed around. It frequently does not get changed. And there are tools out there that will allow you to recover that if it has been lost. So it's not like it is super encrypted or unobtainable. It is helpful to have on as a speed bump, but that's about its best use. And then I want to emphasize, as we talk about security, your last line of security defense is backup and restore. I mentioned the lady who managed to wipe out her AR. She picked up the phone and called IT, and they said, "What backup? We don't have any backups." So that got fixed pretty quickly. That's not something that you want to have happen. And a backup is really not a backup until you have confirmed that you can restore it. So you need to at least have some type of process to periodically do a restore. I know a lot of companies like to back up their production system periodically and restore it to a test environment. That counts. That is testing that your backups work and that you can properly restore them. So if you're doing that on any kind of a regular periodic basis, then you're also able to report back to management that, hey, not only are we doing test systems, but we are actually testing our backup and restore process so that we could get this back, and we are confirming that our backups work. All right, so let's talk about good security rather than just how GP works. So good security in GP really is design. It's not something that you magically fall into. It's not something that you rely on the default GP roles certainly to get you there. It really needs to be designed. And I know a lot of folks have security that's set up. Maybe it's not what you want it to be, and you'd really like to take another shot at that. So we'll kind of walk you through some of the basics here. Anytime you're looking at security at all, either what you have or redesigning it, you want to take a risk-based approach. Be very concerned about security and processes around cash, around whether that's incoming cash or outgoing cash, banking, all of those things you want to be really concerned about. But if you're an organization that is maybe a little different from a standard organization, I've worked with some where they really don't have sales coming in. They're funded someplace else. So they get one wire in once a month, and that's their entire cash in. Then that's a really low-risk operation in terms of someone being able to redirect that. As long as you've got good banking and cash controls, you really don't have to worry about AR at all. So you do want to tackle this in response to your organization and how your organization works. But ideally what you want to do is have a business process map so that you can understand this is how my business works. You want to identify the high-risk processes along with any risks, reviews, reviewers, how often you want that to happen as part of a process. When we talk about reviews, if a review doesn't have evidence that it's been done, a simple review is a bank reconciliation, is a form of review. You're reviewing the bank and you're confirming based on an outside source that yes, it appears that everything went through correctly. If there's not evidence that the reviews are being done, then the review didn't happen. So you can say that you reconciled your bank statement all you want, but if you don't have a copy with proof that you did the reconciliation, if you don't have a printed copy or a PDF copy with the details of that reconciliation, then the fact that you did it and threw it away doesn't matter. It doesn't exist. And then not everything can be controlled by security. Sometimes you need to do mitigations where you're looking at security another way. A great example of that is audit trail. I worked for a company where we had a very small AP department, and we used audit trail as a mitigation tool as well. So our AP person would create the vendor and they would create the voucher. But then before the check could be cut, what would happen is all of those new vendors, that documentation would go to a senior accountant. They would review the documentation to see that it appeared to be genuine. It's a real vendor and not, Bob's Bait Sushi and office supplies or something like that. And then they would compare that against the audit trail to ensure that what was set up for that vendor was appropriately set up in the system, that we weren't redirecting stuff to an incorrect address, an address hadn't been changed inappropriately, those types of things, that the vendor invoice had been signed off on by someone else appropriately, so it was a valid vendor to set up, those types of things. So audit trail can be really helpful from a mitigation standpoint, as can reviews. Our Fastpath GRC Studio tool, which holds all of that reporting, has electronic sign-off. So when you're doing a review, you can actually click a button and be able to sign off electronically and not have to keep all kinds of paper around. We've even got the ability with Audit View. We can send you a report that needs to be reviewed. You can review it in Outlook, and you can actually sign off on it through Outlook. We bring that back into GRC Studio so that we're able to report off of it and demonstrate evidence that the reviews are being done. So a typical approach is to map the process. This is a swim lane example. In this case, the role or department or individual, depending on what level you're mapping this at, goes down the left, and the actual process moves from left to right. You don't necessarily have to do this pretty like this. This is just rows and columns. So you could even just do this in Excel with descriptions if you want to as a starting point. But we'll see everything responsible that order processing is responsible for ends up on this row. Now, there may not be anything in here. It might come back up over here. These all happen to be in a row. So if I'm considering this for segregation of duties, I'm going to want to look at my process map and say, that's a whole lot of work being done in a row by the same person or role in the organization. Should we be looking at this from a segregation of duty standpoint? Mapping out the processes helps a lot of those things come out. After you've mapped the process, again, we talked about taking a task-based approach to this where I have my process now, and what I really want to do is figure out how I get my process into security inside of GP. So the idea is we want to take these tasks. I've mapped out my processes. Maybe I've moved them around a little bit or added a couple of roles to support segregation of duties. And then what I want to do is match the tasks to new roles. So we've got a free tool available from Fastpath that includes, this is the GP Security Matrix. It's an Excel tool where basically you can create your new roles down the left. You just layer them in. You just type them in. It's not more complicated than that. But then we have all of the default tasks inside of GP. You can certainly add your own tasks if you've created custom ones. And it's simply a matter of going down and checking the box next to what's appropriate. So an AP manager can do these particular things. What's nice is there's a tab for each major section of GP, so you could hand out, you could say, here's financial, you do that, here's purchasing, you go do this, and you're not locked into having to do it all at once. What's nice about this is you're starting your new roles, you're adding tasks to these roles, you've got a way to be able to look at this visually and see that it makes sense. You've looked at your processes so it seems to make sense. You're going to want to save off the old roles because when you do apply these, it's possible you've done something wrong, and we do want people to be able to do their job. There's nothing worse in security than having a system that is so tight that people can't actually get any work done. After tasks have been assigned to new roles, those new roles are assigned to users. One point, there's a default user task. That needs to be assigned to every user somewhere along the way. If you want to give it its own role, that's fine. This is what gives access to kind of the basic pieces to navigate around GP. And as I mentioned, the beauty of all of this is that it can be phased. You don't have to fix all of your security all at once. So if you have security that is maybe not where you want it to be, take a risk-based approach and work hard to fix the security around, for example, banking and cash, and then maybe AP or AR, and then financials. Taking that in a phased approach, it won't get you there tomorrow, but it will get you there a whole lot faster because you're taking off bite-sized chunks. And kind of once you've figured all of this out, you're going to want to review it. You want lots of people looking at this from a security standpoint to be able to both get good segregation of duties and identify potential conflicts. Fastpath has a tool called Assure. It will analyze roles and tasks and users set up inside of Dynamics GP. It does two major things. It gives you the ability to review your security in GP. So if someone says, well, you know, who can create a customer in GP? Assure can answer that question for you. Or, you know, who's allowed to cut checks in GP? Common audit type of question. Assure can answer that for you really easily. The second thing that it does is it tackles segregation of duties conflicts. So it's going to show you where your segregation of duties conflicts are. Sometimes those can be fixed through security. As much as possible, that's what you want to do. When they can't be fixed through security, there's a place where you can document, this is my risk, we are mitigating this risk, we have a review, or we have an approval, or we have something else that helps us mitigate this risk in our organization. And so then once you save that, you don't have to mess with it again. When the auditors come back, you're like, yes, we know about this, here's our conflict, here's what we're doing about it. And most of the time, they will want to validate that the reviews are being done if it's a review, or validate that approval is happening if there's an approval, and after that, they're good to go. So that's why it's important when we talk about things like review and being able to do an electronic signature. That's what really proves that your mitigations are working. The challenge with segregation of duties is there are a lot of auditor-created lists out there. Some of them are very, very good about segregation of duties. And those are really things like, they'll say things like being able to create or change a vendor record. And that sounds really simple. But when you go to actually apply that to forms, windows, and tables in GP, it's more complicated than that. And that's where a tool like Assure really makes the difference. Because when you say create a vendor or change an address in GP, it really means the vendor window and the vendor table, access to the vendor table. It means access to the address table because that's where you can actually change or set addresses. It may be access to 1099 tables because that changes vendor address information. There can be lots of things behind this that are not nearly as simple. The vendor EFT table that holds all of the bank account information for electronic payments for a vendor. It's not in an easy to find place. So being able to apply segregation of duties across all of these, our custom rule set does that translation for you. We've worked with auditors, internal and external, to be able to take that. This is what an auditor wants in terms of segregation of duties, and this is how that gets applied to GP. You bridge the gap and make it really easy. All right, a couple of tips as you're reviewing this. As I said, 0 conflicts, 0 productivity. You will probably not get to 0 conflicts. If you do, you're not getting much work done, which is why there are mitigations. It's why things like audit trail can be so helpful for understanding what's going on behind the scenes in your systems. And then finally, you're going to want some sign-off when you get your security design. Ultimately, that won't be the final design, but it's nice to be able to say to folks, you know, if the auditors are looking at it, you're able to say, hey, look, we designed our security. Here's what we've come up with. We put this in place. As we tested it, we made some adjustments we made, but it shows that you actually have a plan and you're taking security seriously. Once you've got your review, you can go and set up security. This is actually really, really simple because you're just creating a role, you're adding the tasks that you've already defined to that role, and you're assigning them to users. Everything is defined. This just becomes an exercise in checking boxes. I would temporarily preserve the existing roles, as I said before. You do want to make sure that, if you've made a mistake, and it happens, if you've made a mistake, then someone can actually cut payroll checks tomorrow, and you can regroup and figure out what went wrong. A lot of folks like to test security in a test environment, which is perfectly fine. You'll do the exact same things, but you'll apply them in a test environment. The trick is that folks want to get it, once they've got it right, they want to get it from test to production. And there's a couple of ways to do that. One of them is if you're using a test company on the same server, then you can copy security from one user to another. The config.ad tool does this really, really well, and it's really simple. GP has a tool that will do it as well. For test servers, you actually need to copy the security data from one table to another. Microsoft MVP David Musgrave, David Musgrave has information, and that's what this link is, on specifically how to do that. So we wanted to give you the tools if you get there and want to move from test to production. This is exactly how to do it, kind of all of the things that you need to do. And then the trickiest part of security is once you get it, it's actually adjusting it. Because what's going to happen is you're going to set security, and something's going to go wrong. You'll miss something. It's not a big deal. And someone's going to call and say, I used to be able to get access to this window, and now I can't. So you got to be prepared to support it once you've got security applied. Whether you're just making small changes or wholesale changes, inevitably there's going to be questions. Sometimes the answer is no, we've changed the process. That job, that function that you're trying to do is now done by Mary. Security was intentionally removed because of a segregation of duties issues. Other times you need to have somebody available who could review that and sign off on approving that. Inevitably, there will be delayed security requests. Someone will come up a month later and they will say, I used to be able to do this in GP. It's the only thing I do once a month, and now they can't do it anymore. Frequently, when redesigning security, those kinds of things get missed. So it's just a matter of being prepared to do this. We've talked about phasing in security. If you tackle it in phases, this is a whole lot easier because you're dealing with just a subset of users around a specific area in GP. So it tends to be a whole lot easier to figure out what needs to be adjusted. The best tool we found for actually working with adjusting security and dealing with those kinds of requests is David Musgrave's GP Power Tools. This is a paid tool. It's a suite of utilities that includes security tools. The best part is when security is denied to a window, it will tell you security was denied to this window. It looks like this. You don't have security privileges to open this window. Security access denied to window. This is the actual window name that you can go and look up and add to a task. So this is the security object that could be added to a task. And this is the dictionary or the application. Something else. Is it GP? Is it field service? Is it project accounting? Which is really helpful to figure out what you need to go fix. And then with a little work, you can train your users to then export this. There's a function to do that and send it to an administrator. An administrator can open it up inside of GP and actually through GP Power Tools get a view that says this is the access the user is requesting. These are the roles and tasks that would provide that access, and these are the roles and tasks that the user actually has. So you can see if maybe there's something that you could give them that would give them that access without granting excess access. So in real life, this is not, working with GP security isn't necessarily a fast process. And unfortunately what happens is it gets jammed in at the end a lot of times when people are doing an implementation and they just kind of rely on the GP default roles. It's really a bit of a project working with GP security. I've been involved with a company that had a failure in internal controls. It was incredibly, awfully expensive. The amount of money that they threw at this was just ridiculous. It effectively blew everyone's budget for the year. It was an open checkbook, and we're just going to write checks to consultants and accountants until either it gets fixed or the money runs out. It is not something you want to have happen. You're much better off spending the money and the time and the energy to get this fixed up front. It is way, way, way cheaper. Don't forget about field level security. Field level security in GP is a way that you can kind of add additional security elements so that you could say, I want to prevent a user from clicking a specific button, or I want a password behind that button, those types of things. The auditors are going to treat field level security as a mitigation because effectively you're customizing security with field level security. So it's not quite the default out of the box, so they're going to want to test those items and ensure that they work as you describe, because you're actually, it's not really programming, but it's kind of programming. You're saying this is what I'm going to allow GP to do or not do, and it's very company specific. So the auditor will want to test that. And then underlying all of this, the ability to put audit trails on any table in GP and be able to capture the information for the important items and be able to say, this is what changed, when it changed, who made the change, really is just huge as a fundamental control behind everything. I'm going to pause for a minute before we go into some of the other elements. Liz, are there any questions on the board?
Oops, there are not. But if anyone wants to ask a question, hold on, I'm sorry. There is, and I apologize because it didn't pop up. It says, I found that if you keep everybody assigned to the existing default user task ID, then it shows that they have access to modules that they should not have, like payroll. I found that if you keep, then it shows that, yeah, so that it says that, it shows that they have, so how do we go ahead and deal with that in terms of default users? I mean, default tasks, and showing that it has access. And there's other questions too, and I apologize. I guess GoToMeeting was not sending them to me the way that I thought. So, Mark, how do you deal with the default tasks that show that users have access to things like payroll when they really don't?
So you can clean up the default user task a little bit. It shouldn't give them access to actually do anything in payroll. It may only give them access to some of the basic menu items there, and it may also be there for some of the self-service pieces that GP keeps rolling in. Really, it would be just taking a good hard look at that default user task and trying to clean some of the things up there.
Okay, so then that is answering another question that we had that says, do you recommend creating a new default user task to reduce conflicts with separation of duties?
I think it depends. If you run the Assure tool and you find you're getting conflicts in the default user task, because Assure is going to tell you what task and role are each one of those items is granting access to each one of those items, then yes, I would go ahead and create a new one. I don't recall seeing a whole lot of conflicts in there from a default user task, but that's something that we can circle back and maybe get a deeper recommendation on.
Okay, next question. What tables do you recommend auditing? I.e., what are the high-risk tables? Transaction-based tables would result in poor system performance. We can't set up triggers as a common response on everything as a common response from IT. So I guess really kind of explain more of taking that risk-based approach and
Sure.
you know, how to determine what the best audit setup would be.
So Audit Trail for GP has a set of templates included that are the most commonly audited items in terms of requests that we see. And then inside of those tables are the most commonly audited fields that people request. So we're not going to audit DEX row ID because it really doesn't have any value from an audit standpoint, for example. We're not going to audit vendor birthday. If you feel that's important, you can always check that box and audit it. But as a most commonly requested vendor birthday, I can tell you is not one of those. So the simplest place to start is there. It tends to be a lot of master records, so customer, vendor, those types of things are the customer, vendor, banking, a chart of accounts setup. Those are the kind of the most common areas. It's also the areas where you see more of the both fraud and mistakes. Is if you can get something wrong upstream in the vendor area and then just get that to flow through the rest of the process, it's a whole lot easier to do something inappropriate rather than trying to change something midstream while something's in process. So we see a lot of that. I would start with that. I would also take a risk-based approach, as Liz mentioned. If you almost everybody has vendors, so they're usually in scope. Everybody has a bank account, so that's usually in scope for everyone. If you have payroll, then payroll's in scope. If you don't use payroll inside of GP, then typically it's not, and you don't have to worry about those things. If project accounting is critical to the operation of your business, then there's absolutely going to be some project accounting tables in there, certainly in terms of contract and project setup, maybe on the invoicing side since project can generate invoices. If you don't use that, then clearly it's out. So from a transactional standpoint, I'll tell you, we really do not see a lot of performance issues on transactions. And we have some folks who definitely do auditing at the transaction level. It depends on what you're trying to get out of the transaction. If you're trying to get the user who created a sales order, that's still a pretty small number. If you're trying to figure out the user who changed the sales order line, that can certainly be a larger number. And for something like that, we can help you with ways to get really good performance out of it. We really don't see a whole lot of problems there. Where we see more performance issues are where someone has turned on Audit Trail for the last 10 years and then wants to go do some reporting and they've never archived anything. Well, then just from a pure reporting standpoint, you're searching through tons of data. That's in a separate reporting database, so you're not interfering with how GP works day to day. But that's more of a performance issue we see than really kind of the day-to-day. You can't audit everything, but you also don't want to sift through everything when you go to do reporting. So I guess that would be my advice, is start at the templates and then based on that, take a risk-based approach at your organization and figure out what's really important to you.
Great, that was it.
All right. So let's look at some of the outline pieces that are not GP that also have some important security implications here. So SSRS is important, especially if you're publicly traded, because you do have to control access to your financial statements. And whether you're publicly traded or not, you don't want someone accidentally changing the structure of your financial statements. You don't want them changing the row values or the column layouts or column setups so that maybe an account is inadvertently left out. So for me, the key with SSRS security is really controlling who can create reports and who can change the building blocks of reports. SSRS security assigns or removes access either to a specific report or a folder. I find that most people use folders. If you have access to payables, you have access to everything in payables. That's just how most people tend to set it up, but you can restrict it by individual report. It can also use Active Directory groups. So this is an important concept. In an Active Directory group, instead of giving a user access, I give the group access. And then when I add users to that group, those users automatically get that access. So rather than having to go into SSRS for every single user, I can have an SSRS group for users who just need to run reports. Then having to remember which boxes to check, we just simply in Active Directory put that user in the correct report and they get the correct security for SSRS. So that's a great way to do it, and that concept of groups and group access actually works in a lot of places that we'll see here, including SSRS Management Reporter, A bunch of our Fastpath tools work that way. ConfigAD can work that way. So it's really a cool concept from that standpoint, because really at the IT level, they just drop them into a group. Security's already been set up for that group, and they're just done. They don't have to spend a whole lot of time remembering how to configure every one of these applications. For MR, same kind of thing. You really want to limit who can create reports, in particular your financial statements. Again, MR can use Active Directory users and groups, and it does offer additional controls. I don't see a lot of people using this in MR, maybe because they tend to have just a few people who both create and generate reports. But inside of Modify User for MR, there is a permissions granted section here that shows you where these pieces are, or how you can limit people. So I can prevent creating reports, I can prevent exporting building blocks, those types of things. ConfigAD can edit management reporter, so if you're wanting to see who's making changes, then ConfigAD, or sorry, not ConfigAD, Audit Trail is able to audit management reporter, so you are able to figure out what's going on behind the scenes in management reporter if you want to do that as well. GP has a new security piece for workflow. It is separate from GP security. It uses Active Directory because you can have approvers who are not GP users. So I could have someone in the purchasing group who is approving requisitions but doesn't actually use GP. So this is Active Directory user and group based. Works the same way. You can give security to a group and then drop the user in that group. In my mind, having worked with this, the focus should really be, from a security standpoint, on workflow managers. They are the folks who can do everything inside of workflow. So in workflow, I would say, I want all new purchase orders greater than $5,000 to flow to this person for approval. They could change that number to be higher or low. The manager sets that rule. So they could change that to be higher or lower. They could temporarily disable the rule. They could do any number of things. So you really want to limit the managers. And that's also where an audit trail on that workflow table could be helpful, to be able to see what changes the managers to workflow are making. So just a quick look at that in the workflow setup table. Here are my managers. This is the person who goes in. Anybody in this box are the people who can go in for this particular workflow, and they can set and control that workflow. And what they would set up is something like here. I'm assigning this. This is the user who is going to do the approval. It can be more than one. There's some time limit, so if they don't do it within a period of time, then another event happens. All of that gets controlled, and one user, multiple users, all users, if this is a group of users. All of those settings are controlled by the managers. So you really want to make sure that you understand who your managers are and what they're doing with respect to GP workflow. And then just one last little tidbit. The user's emails has to be set at the Active Directory level. If you send out a workflow for someone to approve and that email is not set in Active Directory, the email just goes out into La La Land and never returns. GP's web client. GP has a web client. It's now HTML5 based, the newest one. This is a weird little hybrid because it uses Active Directory to actually connect to the web page, and then it uses your GP login to be able to get into GP. There is a form of single sign-on only for the web page, only for the web client that Microsoft uses. Honestly, it's really difficult to set up and get right. I've done it a couple of times, and it's just kind of a pain in the butt to get it to work right. And then once you've got it working right, it only works for the web client. ConfigAD works both on the desktop and for the web client, so you can get a seamless experience for your users regardless of where they're logging in. And then the part that messes with GP administrators is a web client user does not have to be a SQL Server user. This is a change, and it really throws people for a loop. So in this case, I have a GP user, and if you check the box that says web client only user, no SQL Server account, hit the tab for directory account, and assign their Active Directory user, they do not get a SQL user at all. So you could not make this, you could not allow this user to add new users in GP because they don't have a SQL user to be able to change the permissions on. This is strictly a web-based only user. They can't get into GP using the interface, and it really kind of confuses some longtime administrators because they don't exist inside of SQL Server. Almost done here. OData is inside of the brand new version of GP. There's a way to securely access data inside of GP. It's OData. It uses web-based authentication similar to SSL, similar like banking connection or any other type of secure connection. And this is really helpful for things like BI reporting or interacting with maybe a web-based application where you want the data to move securely. That's OData. And in order to make this work, there's a bunch of security features around it. You have to select what data source you even want to make available, and then you have to publish it. And when you publish it, it looks like this, and you get a web address for this is where you go to access the data. This just means that the data is available. Doesn't mean that someone has permission. Permission to access this data gets set via brand new roles and tasks that exist in GP 2016. They all start with, I think it's ODA or ODT for OData. I believe that's correct. But they all start with something, so you can find them all together. But you can also do custom OData sources, so there's a provision to be able to create custom roles and tasks. And just one piece, anyone with the SQL database owner role will be able to access OData even if they don't have explicit access. This is just a function of the way SQL security works, but you're not going to have many, if any, users that are sitting on the SQL database owner's role. And then kind of last but not least, you want to think about other integrating systems. So if you're using Smart Connect from E1 to bring data into GP, and in your process you said, I don't want to allow this user to be able to create journal entries, but yet in Smart Connect, which has its own security setup, that user is allowed to integrate journal entries. You've now bypassed what it is you've bypassed really what you want your security to be. So you want to look at other applications that integrate with GP and ensure that you're not bypassing your other security controls via those applications. This can also include spreadsheets. Having talked to the Microsoft team, they have either 8 or 10 spreadsheets that are in scope for financial reporting. So they are spreadsheets where someone does a bunch of calculations, and based on that calculation, it goes into their ERP system as just a number, and that number significantly affects their financial statements. So those spreadsheets and their changes are in scope for auditing for financial reporting purposes. So you want to make sure that you understand if you have any of those there. What Microsoft actually does is there's a feature inside of Excel that will show you changes between two sheets. So they save off a sheet and lock it down, they make a copy, and they make all of their changes for the next month, and then they run that tool that compares those two things and shows the comparison as an audit for their auditors. So just kind of a quick review of what we do here at Fastpath. Assure is our risk-based security access review and SOD analysis platform. We've got a bunch of reports around security in GP, who your system administrators are, is security on, because there is a master security switch in GP. Access reviews answers all kinds of questions like who can do what in GP, or for this particular user, what can they do for this particular function, who can do it. And then segregation of duties is really, really tied down to really focused on taking those good segregation of duties rules and applying them to the way that Dynamics GP works. Audit Trail will let you track changes inside of GP. Audit View is really designed to be able to take any of our reports, send them out electronically, be able to manage those with a schedule, and then also do remote electronic sign-off on any reports that you can send out. Identity Manager and Config AD work together to be able to provide, Config AD provides single sign-on and a bunch of other single sign-on as well as remote management of GP security, and then Identity Manager sits on top of that to provide user provisioning and to be able to provide a workflow and approval framework around provisioning new users. So I'm going to see if we've got any more questions left over here.
So far, Mark, we do not have any new questions. However, I thank you all for sticking with us. We have gone a few minutes over, so I apologize for that. But I know Mark had a ton of great information to share, so we do appreciate. Wait a second. Let me see if there's any other questions here. If anyone does have a question, please go ahead and send it now. If not, you can always contact us. Our email address is right there at info@gofastpath.com. You can reach us on our website, www.gofastpath.com, or follow us on Twitter. We always have some cool little tidbits about security on there. So, Mark, we didn't get any additional questions. We did get a comment that says Fastpath rocks. Thank you, Sean. We appreciate that vote of confidence. And again, this webinar will be, the recording will be available after the webinar is over. So thank you all again for attending. Really appreciate it. And everyone have a wonderful Thanksgiving holiday. And please contact us if there's anything else that you need or any residual questions that maybe you didn't get a chance to ask during the webinar. Thanks again, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.